on the inner walls of a temple in southern Egypt, carved into stone that has survived for more than 2,000 years, there is a story that begins before Egypt itself existed. Not a myth written down by some later scribe trying to explain the origins of the world in vague symbolic terms, but a detailed, methodical account inscribed by priests who seemed to believe they were recording history. A history of an island with a name, with inhabitants, with a great catastrophe that ended it, and with survivors who wandered afterward and, according to the text, founded the sacred sites that would one day become Egypt itself. This is not speculation pulled from thin air, and it is not a legend reconstructed from scattered fragments and guesswork. These inscriptions exist. They are real, physical, carved into the walls of a temple that still stands today, and they were translated, published, and studied by Egyptologists more than a century ago. They are called the Edfu Building Texts, and tonight we are going to move through them slowly, carefully, the way the priests who carved them seem to want us to. No rushing, no jumping to conclusions, just following the stone, line by line, the way it was meant to be read. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly why this exists. So settle in, get comfortable, and if you would like, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is right now, wherever you are. I read the comments most mornings, and there is something quietly wonderful about seeing London at midnight, and Sydney at sunrise, and Toronto somewhere in between, all listening to the same slow story about a temple wall in Egypt. And if you find these videos helpful for winding down, the best way to support the channel is simply to follow the show on Spotify. The link is in the description. It costs nothing, and it helps more than you might think. Now, back to the temple. The Temple of Horus at Edfu sits on the west bank of the Nile, roughly midway between Luxor and Aswan, and it is, by most measures, the best preserved large temple in all of Egypt. Its walls are not eroded into vague outlines the way so many ancient Egyptian structures are. They are sharp, legible, full, and carved among the more expected inscriptions. The ones praising Horus and recording ritual offerings are a series of texts that Egyptologists eventually grouped together and named the building texts, because on the surface they appear to describe the construction history of the sacred sites at Edfu itself. But the deeper you go into these inscriptions, the stranger and more layered the story becomes. Because according to the priests who carved them, the sacred ground at Edfu was not the first sacred ground. It was, they claim, a successor. A later echo of something that came before, something they called the Island of the Egg, or sometimes the Island of Trampling, a place where certain beings called the Shebtiw lived, where a Falcon god presided, and where, in what the texts describe as the first occasion, something happened that brought that island's story to an end. Inhabitants, a catastrophe, survivors, a migration, and according to the temple's own priests, a direct link between that vanished island and the founding of the very ground beneath the temple where these words were carved. We are going to take our time with all of it. Who found these texts, and how they were first translated. What the priests actually claimed happened in their own carefully recorded sequence. And why, even now, more than a century after these walls were first read by modern eyes, Egyptologists still cannot agree on what any of it actually means. So let the noise of the day fall away, and let us walk quietly into Edfu. The temple itself deserves a slow look before we return to what is written on its walls, because the setting matters, and because understanding where these words are carved helps us understand what kind of claim they were making. Edfu lies in Upper Egypt, on the western bank of the Nile, in that long stretch of river between Luxor and Aswan, where the desert presses close on both sides and the green ribbon of cultivated land narrows to almost nothing before opening again into fields. In antiquity, this was Egyptian territory that had always mattered, a provincial capital, a place of trade and grain and river traffic, but it was never one of the great political centres the way Thebes or Memphis were, and perhaps that is part of why the temple survived so well. Edfu was important enough to be maintained, prayed in, cared for across centuries, but not so central that later conquerors and builders felt compelled to tear it down and build something grander on top of it, the way so many older sacred sites in Egypt were buried under their own later renovations. What stands at Edfu today is not, strictly speaking, an ancient Egyptian temple in the sense that word usually conjures. It was not built by the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, or the New Kingdom, or any of the dynasties whose names tend to come to mind when people picture ancient Egypt. This building, the one whose walls we are about to walk through slowly, was constructed during the Ptolemaic period, the long stretch of Egyptian history that began after Alexander the Great died, and his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt, founding a dynasty of Greek-speaking pharaohs that would rule the country for nearly 3 centuries, right up until the reign of Cleopatra, the last of them, and the eventual absorption of Egypt into the Roman world. Construction on the temple as it stands today began in the year 237 BCE, under Ptolemy III, and it was not finished for well over a century. Work continuing in stages, interrupted at times by political unrest, resumed again by later Ptolemaic rulers, until the temple was finally completed sometime around 57 BCE, just a few years before Cleopatra's own reign began. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The stone we are about to describe, stone that claims to record events from before Egypt existed, from before, according to the priests, even the first gods walked the earth in recognizable form, was carved by masons working under Greek-descended kings, more than 2,000 years after the earliest pyramids had already been standing on the Giza plateau for so long that even the ancient Egyptians of that era considered them impossibly old. This is one of the first puzzles the Edfu Texts present, and we will come back to it in more detail later, but it is worth noting now, quietly, as we walk in. A temple built late in Egyptian history by a dynasty of foreign kings contains inscriptions that claim to describe events from the deep, deep past. Whether those inscriptions are copying something genuinely ancient, or whether they are a late invention dressed in the language of deep time, is a question the texts themselves do not answer for us. They simply state what they state, carved in careful hieroglyphic columns, and leave the reading to whoever comes after. The temple is built from sandstone, quarried from the hills nearby, and it follows the general plan that most large Egyptian temples of this later period share. A great pylon at the entrance, 2 massive tapering towers flanking the doorway, covered floor to ceiling in relief carvings showing the pharaoh, or in this case the Ptolemaic king standing in for the pharaoh, smiting enemies before the gods, a scene repeated so often across Egyptian temple architecture that it becomes almost a kind of punctuation mark, telling you that you are entering a sacred threshold. Beyond the pylon lies an open court, then a series of increasingly enclosed and increasingly dark hypostyle halls, their ceilings held up by columns carved into the shapes of papyrus and lotus, until finally, at the deepest, most hidden point of the temple, sits the sanctuary itself, the small dark chamber where the sacred image of Horus would have been kept, tended daily by priests dressed, fed, and honoured according to rituals that had been performed in one form or another for thousands of years before this particular version of the temple was ever built. All of that is what a visitor walking through the main body of the temple would see, and in a sense, expect to see. Offering scenes, ritual texts, the pharaoh presenting gifts to the gods granting him long life and dominion in return. This is the standard vocabulary of Egyptian temple decoration, repeated across nearly every major temple that survives from this period, at Dendera, at Kom Ombo, at Philae. It is beautiful, and it is meaningful, but in a way it is also expected. Any Egyptologist walking into a Ptolemaic temple already has a fairly good idea of what these particular walls are going to say, because the genre is so consistent. But Edfu has something else, something set apart both physically and in content from everything we have just described. And it is here that the temple stops being merely impressive and starts becoming strange. Surrounding the main body of the temple, forming a kind of buffer between the sacred interior and the outside world, is a massive enclosure wall, what Egyptologists sometimes call the temenos wall, and between this outer wall and the temple proper runs a narrow passage, an ambulatory corridor that circles the building. It is in this passage, along this enclosure, carved onto the inner face of the outer wall itself, that the building texts appear, not scattered here and there among the ritual scenes, but gathered, concentrated, a distinct body of inscription running along a defined stretch of wall, as though the priests who commissioned this carving understood that what they were recording belonged in its own category. Set apart from the daily liturgy of offerings and hymns that filled the rest of the temple. And once you start reading what is actually written there, you understand why they might have felt that way, because these texts do not read like ritual instructions. They do not describe how to present bread and beer to a god, or how to purify a chamber before a festival, or what words to speak while lighting incense at dawn. Egyptologists who have studied this material closely describe it as something closer to a historicized narrative, a sequence of events presented almost like an account of things that actually happened, in a particular order, in a particular place, to particular beings whose names are given and whose actions are described with the kind of specificity you would expect from a chronicle rather than a hymn. The texts speak of an island. They name it in one passage, the Island of the Egg, and in another context, the Island of Trampling, two names that Egyptologists still debate the precise relationship between. They describe beings called the Shebtiw who lived there, and other divine or semi-divine figures the texts call the Djaisu, associated with building and creation. They describe a Falcon, understood to be an early or original form of Horus himself, who is said to have taken up residence there and become, in the language of the text, lord of that island. And they describe, in careful sequence, what happened to that island afterward, an ending, a scattering of survivors, and a claim, made explicitly by the priests themselves, that the sacred ground Edfu descends from that earlier vanished place. This is what makes the building texts different from everything else carved onto this temple, and different in fact from most of what survives from ancient Egyptian religious writing in general. They are not a myth told in the abstract, floating free of any specific location. They are anchored, deliberately, to real geography, tied to the very ground the temple stands on, presented by the priests not as poetic metaphor but as sacred history, a foundation account, a record of how this place came to be holy, going back, according to the text's own internal logic, to a time before Egypt itself had a name. And it was into this passage, along this enclosure wall, that a French Egyptologist would eventually walk with a notebook, and a very great deal of patience, more than a century ago now, to begin the long, slow work of copying down, line by careful line, exactly what the priests of Edfu had chosen to preserve in stone. The man who undertook that work was named Emile Chassinat, and in many ways the story of how we can talk about the Edfu building texts at all is, first, the story of his patience. Chassinat was a French Egyptologist working at the turn of the 20th century, part of that generation of scholars who arrived in Egypt armed not with treasure maps, but with grammar books, ink, and the slowly maturing discipline of philology. By the time he came to Edfu, hieroglyphs had already been deciphered for several decades, and there was an emerging sense among European scholars that, if these temples and tombs were ever going to be truly understood, their inscriptions would have to be copied and published in full, not just in scattered excerpts or pretty vignettes. It was meticulous, unglamorous work, the kind of labour that rarely makes it into popular histories, but without which almost everything we are about to discuss would still be locked on those sandstone walls. Chassinat took Edfu seriously. He did not come for a season, copy a few scenes that happened to interest him, and move on. Instead, he embarked on what would become a project lasting roughly 4 decades, a slow campaign of documentation that tried as far as possible to leave no inscribed surface unrecorded. He traced, collated, checked, and rechecked, returning to the site, comparing copies, consulting other inscriptions to clarify damaged signs. The result of that long, steady effort was not a single slim volume, but a monumental edition of the temple's texts that eventually filled 14 large tomes. Those 14 volumes are not light reading. They are line after line of hieroglyphic transcription, facsimile drawings of reliefs, transliterations into scholarly conventions, and, where possible, translations and notes. They preserve hymns, offering formulae, festival calendars, astronomical ceilings, and all the other genres one expects to find in a great Ptolemaic temple. But nestled within them, given the same careful attention as everything else, are the building texts, the long narrative inscriptions from the enclosure wall that speak of the island, the Shebtiw, the Djaisu, and the Falcon who becomes lord of that place. This is worth dwelling on for a moment because it shapes how we ought to approach these texts. The material we are about to explore did not come to light in a sensational way. It was not announced as some hidden, forbidden chronicle, nor was it pulled from a private hoard and translated in secret. It emerged slowly, almost quietly, through the established procedures of academic Egyptology. Chassinat copied the inscriptions. He published them in a series of volumes through recognized scholarly channels, and those volumes were then read, reviewed, and critiqued by other specialists who, in turn, used them as the basis for their own work. In that sense, the building texts are not fringe material at all. They belong to the same corpus as the better-known temple inscriptions from Dendera or Philae, and they have been sitting for decades on the same library shelves, cited in the same footnotes, indexed in the same catalogues. When later scholars like Eve Reymond, or those who disagreed with her, turned to Edfu in the mid and late 20th century, they did so by opening Chassinat's volumes, checking his hand copies against photographs, and, where possible, against the stone itself, and then building their arguments from there. That does not mean Chassinat's work is beyond question. Like all early editions, his publication reflects the limits of his time, damaged signs that could only be guessed at, readings that would later be refined as grammatical understanding improved, occasional errors that more recent epigraphic surveys have corrected. Egyptologists continue to revisit Edfu, to photograph, to recopy, to propose emendations where the text is worn or ambiguous. But the basic point remains. The building texts, as a body of writing, are not a rumour or a paraphrase. They are preserved in a multi-volume critical edition that has been part of the discipline's reference landscape for more than a century. Because of that, when this video speaks of what the texts say or what the priests recorded, it is leaning on a chain of work that runs from the stone, through Chassinat's notebooks, into those 14 volumes, and then onward into the various studies that have tried to interpret what those lines might mean. Different scholars have drawn different conclusions from them, and we will spend time with those disagreements later, especially the contrast between Eve Reymond's reading and the more cautious views of figures like Finnestad and Kurth. But beneath that debate lies a shared concrete source, the actual hieroglyphic inscriptions as copied and published in that long, painstaking project. This is also why it is possible now for people outside the small circle of Egyptologists to engage with the Edfu texts at all. Once Chassinat's edition existed, translations could be attempted, thematic studies could be written, excerpts could be included in anthologies of Egyptian religious literature. Over time, the building texts moved slowly from being lines on a remote wall in Upper Egypt to being part of a broader conversation about Egyptian cosmology, temple ideology, and mythic geography. They remain specialized, and many of the key discussions about them still happen in technical journals and conference proceedings, but they are no longer hidden. So before we walk along that enclosure wall in words and follow the narrative the priests carved there, it is important to keep this in view. We are not dealing with a text whose existence depends on a single translation or on an uncheckable claim. We are dealing with a set of inscriptions that have been in the light of scholarly scrutiny for generations, documented in exhaustive detail, open to rereading and disagreement, but firmly part of the established record of what the Temple of Horus at Edfu actually contains. With that foundation in place, with the reality and the transmission of the source material settled as far as it can be, we can turn slowly and carefully to the content itself and ask what kind of story the priests believed they were preserving when they filled that outer wall with their account of a vanished island and its builders. When Egyptologists speak of the building texts at Edfu, they are not naming a separate book hidden somewhere in an archive, but a particular cluster of inscriptions on the fabric of the temple itself, passages that the priests carved to tell, in their own terms, how this sacred place came to be. In the most straightforward sense, these are cosmogonical texts. They describe, as the priests understood it, the origin of the world as it touches this precise spot, the way in which a Temple of Horus can stand here at all, on this stretch of the Nile's west bank, in continuity with something that the texts say once existed before Egypt. In modern categories, it is tempting to separate things sharply, on one shelf myth, on another history, somewhere else a stack labelled architecture. The building texts do not recognize those divisions. They have practical elements in which priests recite the divine model for laying out walls, founding foundations, placing shrines. They have narrative stretches in which the texts say that gods stand on a primeval island, organize its spaces, and dwell there. And all of this is framed not as a story told to entertain or to inform outsiders, but as part of an internal temple discourse, words spoken from within the community that served Horus at Edfu for the community itself, to explain to themselves what they believed they were reenacting every time they processed, offered, and rebuilt. This internal voice is one of the most important things to keep in mind. The inscriptions do not read like a royal chronicle carved at Karnak to impress foreign envoys, or like a narrative stela meant to travel. They assume the listener already knows the basic outlines of Egyptian sacred geography, already moves in a world where Heliopolis, Memphis, and Edfu are not just cities but nodes in a divine landscape. The priests are not introducing a new doctrine to strangers. They are aligning their local tradition with a broader theological framework. When they speak of the island, of its inhabitants, and of the catastrophe that overtakes them, they do so in a tone that suggests ritual remembrance rather than revelation, as if they are recalling something always already present in the liturgy and now fixed in stone. The time in which they set this sacred remembrance is given a specific name, ZPTPY, usually rendered the first occasion. This is a standard Egyptian term, used in many contexts, but at Edfu the building texts lean on it heavily. When they say that an act took place in the first occasion, they are not pointing to a date in a royal regnal year. They are pushing the event back into that undatable mythic phase when, in Egyptian thought, the ordered world is just emerging out of undifferentiated waters. The ZPTRY is the time before time, the template moment. The priests present their island narrative as belonging to that horizon, to the same kind of primordial layer that other texts elsewhere associate with the first rising of the sun, the first mound of land, the first articulation of names. Because of that, most Egyptologists treat the building texts less as historical reportage and more as a carefully constructed sacred narrative. The priests are not, in the modern sense, remembering an island in the way a sailor might recall a port he once visited. They are weaving together images, epithets, and stock motifs, from the wider Egyptian cosmogonic tradition and applying them in a systematic way to the site of Edfu. When they say that the temple stands as a successor to a destroyed island, they are speaking through the language of ritual memory, a kind of liturgical anamnesis, in which what is told is understood to be made present again in the act of recitation, regardless of whether or not there was ever a corresponding event in linear time. This does not mean the texts are vague or abstract. On the contrary, they are strikingly particular. They give the island a name and a character. They populate it with specific beings, the Shebtiw and the Djaisu. They assign roles to a Falcon deity who becomes lord of this place. They narrate a series of actions that culminate in violence and ruin. The priests do not just say that there was once a sacred space before Edfu. They outline in sequence how that space was laid out, what was done upon it, how it fell, and how its survivors, as the texts describe them, went out into a world that is only just beginning to become the Egypt we can recognize. At every step, though, the voice remains that of temple insiders, speaking in ritual mode. The verbs are often in forms that suit recitation. The narrative is embedded in larger sequences of offering and dedication. Even the passages that look most like myth in a modern sense are framed by formulae that tie them back into the present tense of cult. As was done in the first occasion, so is done now. The priests do not invite anyone to compare their account with external annals, because they are not offering it on those terms. They're asserting that what happens daily at Edfu is a deliberate repetition of what, in Shebtiw, happened on the island. Scholars like Eve Reymond have taken this ritual narrative seriously enough to ask whether the priests at Edfu, in building up this picture of a primeval island kingdom, might have been curating older layers of tradition, perhaps memories of earlier sacred landscapes now overlaid by the Nile Valley temples. Others, like Finnestad and Kurth, are more cautious, emphasizing how strongly the texts follow known Ptolemaic theological patterns and how thoroughly they can be read as an ideological program for the temple, rather than as a window onto any pre-dynastic reality. The building texts accommodate both readings in the sense that they present themselves as liturgical recollection of a primordial arrangement, without spelling out how, if at all, that arrangement corresponds to anything we could date or locate. For our purposes, it is enough for the moment to understand their basic scope. When the Edfu priests carved these lines, they were not writing a history of Egypt in the way later chroniclers would. They were inscribing a cosmogony centered on their own sanctuary, a story set in the ZP Pi in which a particular island arises, is organized, inhabited, and then destroyed, and in which that destruction sends out a ripple of wandering figures whose actions, as the texts say, lay the foundations for new sacred domains. The Temple of Horus at Edfu is presented as one of those domains consciously built as a successor and memorial. In the sections that follow, we will move more slowly through those elements. We will listen to how the texts describe the island itself, what the priests say about the beings who dwell there, how they narrate its trampling and perishing, and how they imagine the after-story in which displaced builders and gods carry fragments of a lost arrangement into the emerging landscape of shrines and cities. All of it remains, in their own framing, part of the first occasion made present again on the sandstone walls of a Ptolemaic temple. The first thing the Edfu priests do, once they turn from general statements about the first occasion to the place that concerns them most, is to give it a name. They do not simply speak of an island in the abstract. They call it, again and again, the Island of the Egg. In their own phrasing, the texts say that in the first occasion, when the waters were still gathered in their limitless expanse, there came forth an island on which the egg came into being, a place where, as the priests describe it, a mysterious, self-contained seed of life rested upon the flood. To modern ears, this may sound like a sudden poetic flourish, but within the Egyptian cosmogonic vocabulary, it is a very deliberate choice. Elsewhere in Egypt, In Heliopolitan hymns and coffin text spells, the first place to rise from the waters is often called the primeval mound, a hill of earth pushing up through the flood on which a creator god stands or a Benben stone gleams. At Edfu, the building texts take that familiar image and shift it very slightly. The priests do speak in some passages of a mound, but they overlay it with the more intimate and enclosed image of an egg. The first place is not just dry ground. It is, in their language, the island of the egg, a space of emergence where something closed and hidden is about to break open. The texts describe this emergence quietly, almost matter-of-factly. They say that in Shebtiw, the waters of the flood encircled everything, that there was no differentiation yet between one region and another, no gnomes, no cities, no shrines. Then, as the priests have it, a single protrusion appears, a first surface rising out of the unbounded waters. That surface is already an island, already set apart, and upon it, or perhaps as its very essence, lies the egg. The priests do not pause to explain how the egg arrives. They treat it as a given of the first occasion, an element as necessary as the flood itself. In the same way that other traditions speak of the first hill of earth on which the sun is born, the Edfu texts simply say that this is the island in which the egg is established. In some passages they allow the metaphors to layer themselves. The island is called both a mound and a nest, a resting place prepared by the waters themselves for the egg that contains, in compressed form, the potential of gods and ordered spaces. The building texts say that from this egg there issues the first light, that it is here that the Shining One takes form, here that the Falcon deity who will later be identified with Horus of Edfu first appears. But even when they begin to speak of deities and actions, they return to the name. They reinforce gently and repeatedly that all this happens on the island of the egg, as if the designation itself were a ritual refrain. By phrasing it this way, the priests insert their local island firmly into the broader Egyptian pattern of creation out of water, while keeping its character distinct. Where other cosmogonies emphasize a city, Heliopolis, Hermopolis, Memphis, as the place where the first mound rose, the Edfu inscriptions say that the primal appearance takes the form of this island. They do not give it coordinates or distances. They do not say it lay off this shore or it was here before the Nile changed its course. They speak instead in a poetic register in which the geography is symbolic before it is anything else. The island of the egg is, in their voice, the configuration of space that allows creation to begin rather than a point that can be fixed on a later map. At the same time, they are not content to leave it purely abstract. The building texts begin to hint at a layout. They say that on this island places are set apart, that there is a central precinct where the egg is kept, that around it other zones are distinguished. They describe in dense ritual language how certain gods stand upon it, how they circumscribe it, how they protect the egg that lies in its midst. All of this is still anchored in the name. The island is always the island of the egg, never just any land rising from water. The priests are careful to keep the image of emergence, egg on mound, mound in flood at the forefront, even when they move toward more concrete descriptions of shrines and boundaries. Because the voice throughout remains liturgical. The distinction between metaphor and topography is not something the texts themselves mark. When the priests say that this temple is established as the image of the island of the egg, they are not telling us whether they believe that island once existed as a physical location that could have been visited, or whether they take it to be a timeless pattern inscribed in the first occasion. Eve Reymond tends to read their consistency on this point as evidence that they are preserving an old idea of a particular sacred place, perhaps once associated with an actual early sanctuary. Scholars like Finnestad and Kurth are more inclined to see the egg and the island as calculated theological motifs, chosen because they resonate with canonical creation imagery, and because they can be architecturally mirrored in the Ptolemaic temple plan. The texts themselves do not resolve this for us. They simply maintain, with liturgical steadiness, that creation, insofar as it concerns Edfu, takes its start on an island named for an egg, rising out of the waters in the first occasion. They say that this is where the first organization of sacred space occurs, that this is where the beings who will build and inhabit it first appear, that this is where the pattern is set which the later temple repeats. Whether we choose to see the island of the egg as a remembered place, as a theological construct, or as some blend of both, we are following interpretations that go beyond what the priests themselves spell out. On the sandstone walls, their task is more contained. They name the island, they link it to the primeval waters and mound. They say that creation begins there, and they fold that beginning into the daily round of cult, in which the egg is always, in some sense, still poised on its island, waiting to open again. After lingering so long on the gentler name, the island of the egg, the texts quietly introduce another designation that sits beside it, and at first glance seems to belong to a very different mood. In a number of passages, the same place is called the Island of Trampling. The priests do not announce this as a correction, or as though they are turning to a new location. They simply shift the epithet, as if to remind the listener that the first land of emergence can also be spoken of in harsher terms. Modern translators have had to pause here and ask what, in Egyptian, this trampling might mean. The verb that underlies the epithet can carry the simple sense of treading underfoot, of stamping, but it can also shade into meanings of subduing, pressing down, or ritually purifying by passage. Some have suggested that the Island of Trampling is the island as a place of victorious footing, a surface upon which the creator god, or the Falcon who will become Horus of Edfu, first finds secure ground and asserts control over the undifferentiated flood. Others read in it a memory of conflict. The thought that this first mound was not merely a nest for an egg, but also the scene of a primordial struggle in which chaotic forces are trampled and held beneath the ordered space. The building texts themselves do not spell out an explanation, but they hint at these possibilities through the way they describe actions on the island when this epithet is used. In some sections, the priests say that the gods stand upon the island and trample that which belongs to the enemy, or they speak of the ground as a place where hostile beings are trodden down. In that liturgical voice, trampling is not random violence. It is an image of establishing order, of making firm what was previously unstable. To tread something underfoot is, in this idiom, to render it harmless, to push it beneath the level of the sacred surface on which the falcon god will dwell. At the same time, the name almost certainly had ritual resonances that the priests expected their own audience to feel without commentary. In Egyptian temple practice, the ground of a sanctuary was understood as symbolically crushing the enemies of the god. Floor slabs and thresholds sometimes carried images of bound foes, intended to be walked upon by priests and statues alike. When the Edfu texts call their primeval place the Island of Trampling, they may be projecting that familiar ritual gesture backwards into the first occasion. The priests recorded that even in Zib-Pi, before there were nomes or cities, there was already a consecrated surface on which the powers of disorder were kept beneath the feet of the gods. Yet for all of this, the sacred status of the island is not diminished by the harsher epithet. If anything, the use of trampling intensifies its role as a protected and protective space. The texts say that on this island the gods encircle the central precinct, that they mark off its limits and keep pure its surface. They speak of it as a holy ground in the midst of the flood, a place that nothing unpurified may enter. The very act of trampling in this liturgical imagination belongs within that sacralization. To be trodden on here is to be excluded from the circle of the holy. The island's holiness is defined partly by what it presses down and keeps outside. Seen in this way, the two names begin to echo one another rather than to contradict. The Island of the Egg evokes the quiet, enclosed potential at the beginning of things, the sense of a delicate vessel of life resting on the first mound. The Island of Trampling brings into focus what must happen if that potential is to unfold. The surrounding chaos must be held back. Otherness must be pressed underfoot. Boundaries must be enforced. Many Egyptologists therefore read the alternation of names as a way of presenting the same primeval site at different mythic moments. When the priests are speaking of incubation and emergence, they favour the egg. When they turn to the establishment of order, the defeat of enemies, or the laying out of sacred ground, they call it the Island of Trampling. The Edfu inscriptions themselves support this reading by the way they move between the epithets without suggesting a new geography. When they say that this temple is the image of the Island of the Egg, and elsewhere that it is founded like the Island of Trampling, they are not claiming two different prototypes. They are layering aspects of one original configuration. The same first surface can be remembered as nest and as treading place, as soft enclosure and as firm ground. In priestly thought, these dimensions cannot be separated. To found a temple is to recall both the nurturing of the egg and the decisive trampling that makes space safe for the god. For Eve Reymond, this play of names is one more indication that the priests were preserving a complex, perhaps very old memory of a particular sacred landscape. On her reading, an early cult centre, whether on an actual island or an elevated stretch of land, could have been experienced as both a place of gentle origin and a site of ritual subjugation of danger, and these experiences were crystallized into the paired epithets. Scholars like Finnestad and Kurth are more cautious. They tend to see the dual naming as part of a sophisticated Ptolemaic theology, in which the same theoretical first place is given multiple titles to express its role as both cradle and fortress of creation, without implying any historical sanctuary behind it. The texts, as before, do not require us to decide between these approaches. They simply hold both names together, and through them they keep the island always close to the concerns of the Edfu temple. Whether it is called the Island of the Egg or the Island of Trampling, it is presented as the originating pattern of the sanctuary in which the priests are standing. In their account, this is the ground plan established in the first occasion, the sacred place on which gods first stood, first protected, first organized space. By naming it in these different ways, they draw their own building into that remembered pattern, so that each ritual step within the temple recapitulates a step once taken, as they say, upon that primeval island rising out of the flood. When the priests have dwelt for some time on the island itself, on its egg-like enclosure and its trampling surface, the texts begin quietly to people it. Among the first inhabitants they name are a group called the Shebtiw. The word appears in the building texts as a collective, usually with the definite article, the Shebtiw, as though the audience is expected to recognize them as a particular category of beings already familiar from older tradition. The inscriptions do not pause to define them in modern terms. Instead, they weave them into the narrative of the first occasion, letting their character be inferred from what they are said to do upon the island. In several passages, the priests say that the Shebtiw dwell or sit on the primeval mound, that they are those who are on the island, or those who encircle the house of the Falcon. In others, they are described as taking part in the earliest acts of creation and ordering. The texts speak of them as present when the first shrine is staked out, when the limits of the sacred ground are marked with rope, when offerings are first laid before the nascent god. They are named among those who praise and acclaim at the very beginning, when the falcon first appears upon the island, and in some versions they are said to fashion or stabilize elements of the cultic space. In this liturgical voice, the Shebtiw are portrayed as co-participants in the founding of the sacred domain, not as passive bystanders. Modern Egyptologists have tried to understand what sort of beings the texts are gesturing toward with this name, but there is no firm consensus. Some scholars have proposed that the Shebtiw are a special class of gods, perhaps local manifestations or attendants of Horus, whose task is to secure his first dwelling place. Others have wondered whether they might be a mythic reflex of very ancient priestly or ancestral figures, projected back into ZPT-Pi as those who first served in the earliest sanctuary. Still others read them more abstractly, as symbolic personifications of functions, guarding, praising, measuring, rather than as individual personalities. Because the building texts themselves do not step outside their ritual idiom to explain, these remain suggestions rather than settled identifications. The language of the inscriptions, however, does give some hints. The priests occasionally call the Shebtiw those who are noble on the island, or the venerable ones of the first time. They are grouped in some columns alongside familiar divine companies such as the Ennead, as though they belong within the broader divine society. At the same time, there are passages in which their actions on the island resemble what human ritual specialists would later do in temples. The Shebtiw are described as bearing the rope, setting up the posts, proclaiming the names of parts of the house. These are all technical expressions for foundation rites in historical Egypt. When the texts say the Shebtiw are doing these things in ZPT-Pi, they may be projecting the work of priests and builders back into the mythical beginning, turning those roles into semi-divine actors on the first island. This ambiguity is one reason the Shebtiw have attracted attention from scholars like Eve Reymond. On her reading, the way the texts speak of the Shebtiw hints at a memory, however reworked, of an early community whose sacred activities were later mythologized. She suggests that the noble ones on the island could be preserving, in theological form, the image of founding officiants at some very old sanctuary, whose actions laying out cords, setting posts, naming spaces were remembered and raised into the mythic sphere. By contrast, researchers such as Finnestad and Kurth prefer to understand the Shebtiw as a purely theological construct within Ptolemaic thought, a way of personifying the procedures of temple building and cult installation, without implying any particular group of historical founders behind them. The texts themselves do not require the listener to choose. They simply keep returning to the Shebtiw as a familiar chorus in the story of the island. When an offering is said to be placed before the Falcon on his island, the priests add that the Shebtiw are content, as if these beings are the proper witnesses of cultic correctness. When the ground plan of the temple is equated with that of the primeval mound, the Shebtiw are described as surrounding it, guarding its approaches, keeping far what is hostile. In this way, their presence aligns closely with the dual character of the island already described. On the island of the egg, they are those who sit in veneration around the emerging life of the god. On the Island of Trampling, they are those who form its living perimeter, ensuring that what is to be trodden down remains beneath the level of the sacred surface. Some passages even speak of the Shebtiw as bearing specific cult objects or emblems, though the fragmentary state of the inscriptions makes details uncertain. There are hints that they carry standards, that they lift up the Falcon, that they participate in the first circuit around his house. Elsewhere, the priests mention that their names are many and their forms are hidden, a formula often used in Egyptian texts for divine or semi-divine collectives whose exact number and identity are flexible. This has led some interpreters to compare them, cautiously, to other godly groups such as the followers of Horus or the ancestral spirits, sometimes evoked in funerary contexts, though the building texts do not explicitly equate them. Because of this mixture of divine titles, priestly functions, and ancestral overtones, the Shebtiw resists simple classification. The safest way to describe them is the way the texts themselves do, as a company of beings who inhabit the island in the first occasion, who assist in the establishment of the god's house, and who continue in the imagination of the Edfu clergy to stand around every later sanctuary that is patterned on that original. Whether one thinks of them as gods, as transfigured founders, or as symbolic embodiments of ritual acts, the role ascribed to them by the priests is clear enough. They are part of the machinery by which the island is made habitable and holy. As the narrative of the walls continues, these island dwellers will be joined by other figures, some more clearly divine, some explicitly described as builder gods. The Shebtiw sit near the threshold of that transition. They allow the priests to speak of a populated island, an island not empty rock but already surrounded by attentive presences, before turning to the more architecturally focused beings who will be said, in the next sections, to shape and raise the very structures whose imprint Edfu claims to copy. As the walls proceed, the priests do not leave the Shebtiw alone on the island for long. Another name begins to appear in the columns, another collective that, like the Shebtiw, is treated as if it should already be familiar. The texts speak of the Djaisu. The term is rare in Egyptian texts as a whole, but at Edfu it is written with a consistency that suggests the scribes were guarding an inherited designation, rather than inventing one for the occasion. Once again, the inscriptions do not offer a definition in the modern sense. They simply begin to say that the Djaisu are there, that they act upon the island, that they are counted among those present in the first arrangement of the sacred ground. In several passages, the priests place the Djaisu in close proximity to the Shebtiw, sometimes in parallel phrases, sometimes in short god lists that combine them into a kind of working company. Where the Shebtiw are those who sit and encircle, the Djaisu are given more active epithets. The texts speak of them as those who make firm, those who complete, and occasionally those who fashion the forms of what will later be recognized as parts of the cultic installation. They are not yet called builder gods in our modern vocabulary, but the activities attributed to them move in that direction. Elsewhere on the walls, a more explicit category appears. The priests write of the gods who build the house, the company of the fashioners of the sanctuary, and similar expressions that modern scholars have conveniently grouped under the title builder gods. In the building texts, these gods are said to stretch the cord with the falcon, strike the pegs, raise up the walls and establish the mounds that define the precinct. The language echoes with deliberate care the technical phrases used in historical Egypt for the foundation ceremonies of temples. When the texts say that these divine craftsmen do these things on the island in the first time, they are mapping the well-known ritual procedures of their own day back onto the mythic landscape of ZPPY. How exactly the Djaisu fit into this constellation of builder gods is one of the puzzles that commentators such as Eve Reymond have pondered. In some columns, the Djaisu appear almost as a subset of the builder deities, a specialized group within the larger company. In others, the two designations seem to overlap in function, the Djaisu doing what elsewhere is assigned more generally to the gods who build. The priests will, for instance, say that the Djaisu erect the enclosure wall, and a little further on that, the builder gods raise up its pillars, as if these two collectives are cooperating on the same task, or perhaps represent different aspects of it. Because the texts never pause to tell the listener that the Djaisu are such and such kind of god, this relationship has to be inferred from these patterned descriptions. Within the internal mythology of the temple, the interplay between the Shebtiw, the Djaisu, and the builder gods helps to distribute the many acts involved in founding a sanctuary across several named collectives. The Shebtiw, as the previous section showed, are often described as those who surround, guard, and acclaim. The Djaisu tend to be described as those who fix, complete, and give distinctive shapes. The builder gods, as a broader category, are those who perform the recognizable building rites, surveying, measuring, leveling, laying foundations, raising walls. All of them, however, are said by the priests to be active together on the island, so that the making of the god's first dwelling is not a single gesture but a multi-phased operation involving different orders of beings. From a theological point of view, this distribution allows the Edfu clergy to weave several strands of tradition into one fabric. On one level, they are invoking the very old Egyptian habit of personifying crafts and functions as divine entities. On another, they are accommodating specific local names, such as the Djaisu that may have belonged to earlier strata of regional myth, now being integrated into a Ptolemaic temple theology. Reymond has suggested that the Djaisu could preserve the shadow of an ancient builder group in some forgotten sanctuary, mythologized here as those who make firm the earliest sacred centre. Scholars like Finnestad and Kurth are more cautious, preferring to see the Djaisu simply as one of several Ptolemaic inventions used to populate the primordial scene with functionally differentiated helpers. Whatever their ultimate origin, the role the texts assign to them is clear. When the priests explain why the temple at Edfu has a particular arrangement of walls, courts, chapels, and subsidiary rooms, they often do so by saying that it is as in the first time when the Djaisu set down its likeness, or that its plan is that which the builder gods made upon the island. Architectural features are thus given mythic prototypes. A gate is not merely a gate, it is the gate which the Djaisu first caused to stand. A columned hall is the place of pillars that the gods of building raised at the side of the Falcon. An enclosure wall is like that which encircled the island when the Djaisu established its boundary. In this way, the Djaisu and the builder gods become narrative tools for the priests to talk about their own sacred architecture. They allow an otherwise practical question. Why is the sanctuary built like this, and not otherwise, to be answered in mythic terms? It is so, the inscriptions say, because on the primeval island beings called the Djaisu once completed its form in this particular way, and the gods who build once made firm its parts, according to a pattern that every legitimate temple must echo. The building texts do not present these figures as literal masons from a lost age. They present them as divine or semi-divine actors whose stylized labours sanctify and justify the current layout. For the listener within the temple, perhaps lying in the hypostyle hall while the evening breeze moves softly through the columns, this has a calming implication. To be within Edfu's walls is, in the language of the priests, to be within a shape first traced by the Djaisu and executed by the builder gods on the island at the beginning of things. The stones, the proportions, the progression from outer court to inner shrine all participate in that remembered pattern. The Shebtiw still sit around it, the Djaisu still make it firm, the builder gods are still, in a ritual sense, raising its walls whenever offerings are brought and hymns recited. Whether one takes Reymond's suggestion of remote memories or follows the more strictly theological reading of Finnestad and Kurth, the effect within the narrative is the same. The temple is not an arbitrary human construction, but a deliberate reenactment of a cosmic building, carried out in company with these named beings whose actions the texts preserve in their slow, careful lines. As this company of builders is assembled on the walls, another quieter group edges into view. The priests begin to speak, almost in passing at first, of the 7 sages. They are not introduced with fanfare. There is no genealogy, no tale of their birth. The texts simply start to say that such and such a rite was first known to the 7 sages, or that a particular arrangement of shrines is according to the teaching of the 7 sages of the island. Like the Shebtiw and the Djaisu, they arrive already presupposed, as if the listener is expected to nod in recognition at a name that belongs to an older layer of temple speech. In the building texts themselves, the 7 sages are not described as masons or surveyors. The verbs that cluster around them are not those of lifting, striking pegs or measuring cords, but those of knowing and transmitting. The priests say that the sages understood the writings of the first time, that they set down the rules of offering and that they made known the names of the places where the god rests, where the Djaisu make firm the physical structure. The 7 sages are presented as those who lay down the pattern of knowledge that will live within that structure. Several passages place them at crucial thresholds in the foundation story. When the island is first said to be ordered into distinct zones, sanctuary, court, surrounding waters, the texts remark that the 7 sages distinguished its domains. When the first cult image is installed, they say that the 7 sages taught the manner of its service. When the builder gods complete their work, a formula appears that they did according to what the 7 sages had uttered. The Edfu priests, in other words, cast these figures as the ones who define the rules, the ritual scripts, the correct ways of doing things that make a space not only built, but sacred. This is not entirely isolated to Edfu. Elsewhere in Egyptian tradition there are hints of comparable groupings, companies of learned gods or semi-divine sages associated with the great creator, figures linked with Thoth or with primeval kings, tutelary beings of writing and sacred instruction. The Memphite and Heliopolitan systems know of godly counselors who assist at creation, and later lists of wise men from the Old Kingdom sometimes echo this pattern of 7 exemplary figures. The Edfu texts do not explicitly tie their 7 sages to these other traditions, but for a reader familiar with the broader corpus, the resonance is there in the background, like a familiar chord played in a slightly new progression. Within the internal logic of the building texts, the 7 sages function less as personalities and more as a category, a way of speaking about the origin of ritual knowledge. The priests repeatedly attribute to them the foundation of the words and the first setting in place of the writings that govern temple life. They are said to have established the names of the sacred places, to have fixed the days on which ceremonies are to be performed, and to have revealed the secret ways of approaching the shrine. The technical details of cult practice, procession routes, offering lists, invocations, are thus not explained as the work of inventive human clergy, but as something first articulated by these mythic teachers on the island in ZPTPY. This gives the Edfu narrative another layer of depth. The Djaisu, as the previous section traced, are those who complete the form of the sanctuary, while the builder gods raise its walls and stretch the cord with the Falcon. The 7 sages inhabit a different plane. They are invoked when the texts shift from matter to meaning, from stones to speech. When a prayer is recited as the sages spoke it, or a rite is performed according to their plan, the priests are effectively saying that every legitimate gesture in the temple has a prototype not only in a primeval building activity, but in a primeval act of understanding. Eve Reymond has drawn attention to how carefully the Edfu inscriptions weave these 7 sages into the sequence of events. In her reading, they may preserve the memory of an old conception of sacerdotal authority, perhaps a very ancient set of local tutelary figures who once guaranteed the correctness of ritual in a now lost sanctuary. By relocating them to the island and having them instruct the gods themselves in cultic propriety, the Ptolemaic priests of Edfu, on this view, are elevating that old notion into a cosmological key. Scholars, such as Finnestad and Kurth, prefer to see the sages as part of a more systematic theological effort, a late Ptolemaic construction that distributes functions, guarding, building, knowing among different collectives in order to mirror and legitimize the temple's own hierarchy of roles. Whichever emphasis one follows, the way the texts themselves speak is consistent. The 7 sages are always framed as figures of the first time, always placed on the island or in the immediate aftermath of its ordering, always associated with the origination of knowledge rather than with the execution of physical tasks. They are not described as sitting in historical courts, nor as travelling between actual cities, nor as leaving behind treatises in the way later literate cultures imagined their philosophers. The Edfu priests do not present them as a council of human wise men whose minutes we have somehow lost. They present them instead as mythic custodians of insight, beings who stand at the point where formlessness gives way, not only to shape, but to understanding of that shape. In doing so, the building texts offer a bridge between the remote, almost abstract scene of the island and the very concrete routines of the temple. When a priest at Edfu traces a circuit around the sanctuary on a festival day, the inscriptions can say that he walks the path which the seven sages first marked. When he recites a difficult sequence of divine names, they can say that these are the words which the seven sages caused to be remembered. The chain runs, in their telling, from the primeval councillors on the island, through the gods they instructed, down to the liturgies of Ptolemaic Egypt. For a listener lying beneath the darkened ceiling, hearing these lines murmured in the half-light, the effect is to fold human practice into a long, slow continuity. The rites being performed are not improvisations. They are echoes of what the texts say was once spoken, and once discerned in the quiet presence of the god on the island. Whether one leans toward Reymond's suggestion of deep, perhaps regional memories, or towards the more guarded view that sees here a late, orderly theology, the seven sages remain. Within the narrative, a gentle but decisive link, the ones who carry awareness from the first occasion into every later temple, so that each new sanctuary is not only built like the island, but also thinks and prays in its shadow. Amid this careful arrangement of builders and sages, one figure has been present all along, almost taken for granted, and in this part of the story the priests allow him to come a little more clearly into view. The texts say that over the island there presided a Falcon, a lord whose very nature was to soar above and to alight upon chosen places. Sometimes he is named directly. Sometimes he is simply the Falcon or the great god, lord of the island. In the language of the walls, his presence is not argued for or explained. It is simply assumed that the island, if it is to be truly ordered and sanctified, must stand under the eye of this bird-formed god. The Edfu priests do not leave the identity of this falcon entirely abstract. Again and again, they use titles that, in other parts of the temple, belong unmistakably to Horus. They call him the Falcon of Gold, the great god son of Isis, the victorious one who dwells in Edfu. They say that his nest was on the island in the first time, and that his throne was established there. In doing so, they draw a continuous line from the divine lord of their present shrine back into the shadowy landscape of ZPPY, the Horus who receives offerings in the inner sanctuary, who is carried in procession on feast days, is said to be the same Horus who once took up lordship over the primeval mound. This is not a neutral choice of imagery. In Egyptian tradition more broadly, Horus is many things: sky god, avenger son, royal patron. But at Edfu in particular he is overwhelmingly present as a falcon, a sharp-eyed, high-flying predator who can descend with precision on his prey and then return to his perch. When the building texts speak of the falcon who surveys the island, or of the falcon who sees every place where the builders stand, they are using a familiar icon of kingship and divine oversight. Yet here, on the island, there is no mention of human kings at all. The highest authority the priests acknowledge in their narrative is this avian lord. Several passages underline his role in the ordering of the site. The texts say that the builders stretched the cord with the falcon, a phrase that suggests he is present at the very act of marking out the ground. They speak of the island which His Majesty selected for himself, as if the location is chosen by his gaze rather than by any council or surveyor. They describe the seven sages as those who made known the resting places of the falcon, and the Djaisu as those who set firm his place of alighting. Every collective that has appeared so far, the warriors, the builders, the sages, is in some way oriented around where the falcon stands, where he lands, where he wishes to dwell. On the island, his lordship is not framed in terms of issuing decrees or hearing petitions in the manner of a human monarch. Instead, The verbs that cluster around him are those of seeing, choosing, protecting and inhabiting. The priests say that he watched over the company of the gods, that he selected their seats, that he encircled the island with his shadow. In one hymn within the building texts, they speak of the Falcon who established himself upon the great perch, who made the island his horizon. The sense is that his presence saturates the space, making it secure and meaningful, rather than that he governs it through human-like administration. For the Edfu clergy who carved these words, this falcon lordship serves a clear theological function. By placing Horus in falcon form at the centre of the Shebtiw narrative, they can say that their own temple, which bears his name and enshrines his image, stands in direct continuity with that first ideal arrangement. When they write that this is the house of the falcon upon earth, likeness of his first perch, or that its court is the island which he chose in the beginning, they are not claiming an independent human lineage for their sanctuary. They are anchoring it instead in the movements and preferences of a god who has, in their telling, always been lord over the same essential place. Eve Reymond has suggested that in these references to the falcon's earlier nest or throne on the mysterious island, there may be echoes of a very old, perhaps pre-dynastic sacred landscape in which a falcon god once presided over a local cult centre, now remembered only in these mythic terms. On this view, the priests of Ptolemaic Edfu, by saying that their Horus first ruled on an island in ZPPY, are lifting a once regional falcon shrine into the register of cosmic beginnings. Scholars such as Finnestad and Kurth, by contrast, tend to read the same material as part of a more systematic theological exercise, a late, careful mapping of the temple's patron deity onto the structures of creation, so that the god of Edfu occupies the same central place in mythic time that he does in the liturgical present. Whichever emphasis one follows, the texts themselves maintain a consistent way of speaking. The falcon is always the ruling presence, but never in a way that turns him into a historical king. He does not receive ambassadors from neighbouring lands. He does not found cities in the Nile Valley. He does not sit in judgment over mortal disputes. Instead, he hovers as a kind of pure sovereignty, the one whose attention consecrates the ground, whose choice makes a location into a sanctuary. The priests do not describe human subjects swearing oaths of fealty. They describe companies of gods assembling beneath his wings and sacred domains being placed under his protection. This will matter later, when the building texts begin to speak of kingdoms and domains, and of rulers who wander after the island's destruction. For now, it is enough to notice that the foundational pattern they establish is not one of a human ruler commanding a territory, but of a divine falcon installing himself on a chosen height, and by that act alone, bringing order and safety to the beings who gather around him. In the quiet logic of the narrative, the island is his by inspection and by dwelling, not by conquest. As the section closes, the falcon's role can be felt as a steady, almost silent axis around which all the other elements turn. The builders measure with his eye as their guide. The 7 sages distinguish the places of his resting. The various divine companies fight, build, and know. But it is the falcon who simply is there, established on his perch, transforming a patch of primeval land into what the priests will later dare to call a kingdom. In their telling, the life of the island in the first occasion unfolds entirely within the shelter of his gaze. In this stillness under the falcon's gaze, the priests say that a particular quality settled over the island during ZPTPY, the first occasion. They do not describe bustling streets or clamour, nor do they imagine ships coming and going, or markets rising and falling. Instead, the building texts dwell on an atmosphere that is almost entirely one of balance. They speak of the island in its wholeness, of the gods dwelling each in his place, of the measures being complete. The impression is of a world that has not yet frayed at the edges a pattern that has just been laid down and is still perfectly aligned. The language they use for this time is gentle and orderly. The texts say that every god knew his seat, and that their shrines were fixed like the sky. They speak of offerings that arrive in their time, and of rituals that are performed according to their writings in the first day. When they mention movement, it is not hurried or chaotic. The gods go forth, come in, circle the island, but always in a way that seems to affirm the existing order rather than disturb it. This is not a narrative of foundation followed by struggle. It is a description of foundation as a kind of ongoing calm. Within this calm, the priests let us glimpse a daily rhythm that is divine rather than human. They say that the great company rises at dawn upon the island, that they greet the light together, and that they sit in council beneath the shadow of the Falcon. There is no sense that they are learning their roles as they go. Instead, the texts insist that these roles are already known, already written, as though the first occasion is less a beginning in our sense, and more the first clear appearance of something that was always meant to be. The island becomes a stage on which a completed script is first performed. Over and over, the building texts emphasize completeness. They speak of the plans which were finished in writing upon the island, of the measurements which were not lacking, of every sacred name which was made manifest there. The 7 sages, who earlier were described as revealing the layout of shrines, are now said to confirm the words of the writings and to establish the rules for every rite. The Djaisu, who fixed the foundations, are described as those who made firm the limits so that none might transgress them. Together, these groups represent not work in progress, but work brought to a kind of quiet conclusion. In this framing, the island during ZP Pi functions as a golden age within the temple's own inner story, though the priests never use that phrase. The qualities they attach to it, rightness, precision, fullness, are those that any later sanctuary would wish to claim. The texts say that discord did not exist upon the island, that no one opposed the decree of the Falcon, and that their speech was one, their hearts were in harmony. These are not observations about politics, they are assertions about ritual and cosmic alignment. To live in that time, according to the priests, was to inhabit a pattern in which every action flowed from a correct place and returned to it. This idealization has a clear function for the Edfu clergy. When they speak of the island as the place where the divine order was complete, they are quietly setting up a standard against which their own temple can be measured. The walls proclaim that this house repeats the writings of the first time, that its foundations are according to the island that came into being at the beginning, that its rites are those which were done there in secret. By describing the life of the island in such finished harmonious terms, they give themselves a model to emulate and a source to which they can claim direct access. At the same time, this golden completeness is not presented as something vague or abstract. The priests describe specific activities that mark the island's life, the daily circuit of the god, the appearance of offerings, the recitation of names. They say that the gods came forth in procession around the mound, that they purified themselves in the surrounding waters, that they returned to their seats when the falcon alighted. These patterned movements do not change the island, they affirm it. In the priest's language, nothing essential is added or subtracted. The island is already what it must be, and the life upon it is a constant acknowledgement of that finished state. This way of speaking has made room for differing scholarly readings. Eve Reymond has suggested that the priests may be preserving in mythic form a memory of some earlier sacred arrangement, perhaps an old cult centre whose rituals were later projected back into ZP Pi and raised to the status of an original pattern. On this reading, the Golden Age character of the first occasion would be partly the glow of retrospect, a way of investing inherited rights with primordial authority. Finnestad and Kurth, by contrast, tend to see the same material as a systematic theological construction in which the life of the island is carefully shaped to supply the Edfu temple with an exemplary blueprint, an ideal order that justifies its Ptolemaic institutions. The building texts themselves, however, do not choose between these possibilities. They simply maintain the tone of completed order. They say that no enemy set foot upon the island, that no storm disturbed its waters, that the years passed in joy beneath the wings of the Falcon. Even when they hint at the existence of time, years, days, seasons, those units do not seem to carry erosion or decay. Time, in the first occasion, is treated as repetition, not as loss. It is precisely this stillness that gives the later narrative its weight. By lingering so long on the image of an island where the pattern is perfect, where every god is at peace and every rite is correct, the priests prepare the listener for the shock of what they will later recount. When they finally allow change to enter the story, it will not be the gentle, cyclical change that marks the life of Shebtiw, but something abrupt and violent. For now they keep us within the circle of the first occasion, in a world where nothing essential has yet been broken, and where the island under the Falcon's quiet oversight seems as though it could endure forever. When the priests finally allow that calm to break, they do so in words that remain measured, but the content itself is abrupt. After page upon page of completeness, the building texts simply begin to speak of an undoing. They say that the island was seized by tumult, that confusion entered into the company of the gods, and that the decree went forth that its time should end. There is no long build-up, no detailed list of causes. In the way the texts present it, the island's destruction arrives as a decision spoken in the divine realm, and then made real. The priests do not describe a human war or an invasion, or anything that we would easily map onto historical events. Their language remains cosmic. They say that the waters rose around the primeval mound, that the limits set by the Djaisu were overstepped, and that the encircling flood came in a single moment. Elsewhere, they hint that fire was also involved. One passage speaks of the flames that licked the sides of the island, another of the heat that consumed what had been made. The impression is of elements turning against the ordered world they had previously supported. Even here the texts keep their focus on the island itself, rather than on spectacle. They say that the ground shook beneath the seats of the gods, that the shrines trembled where they had been fixed like the sky, that the sacred images fell upon their faces. The island is described as losing the very qualities that defined it in Shebtiw. Where earlier it was firm, it is now said to be loosened. Where its measures were complete, they are now called scattered. Where no storm disturbed its waters, the priests now write that the storm burst forth upon it without warning. The priests do not linger on sensory detail. They do not tell us what this would have looked like from a distance, or how long it lasted. They move instead through a series of ritual statements, as if reciting the stages of a known pattern. They say that the writing of the first time was rolled up, that the books of the island were hidden, that the plans were taken back into the heart of the god. In this telling, destruction is not only physical, it is also a withdrawal of revelation. What had been open is made secret again. Because the building texts are a liturgical composition, they frame this catastrophe in terms of divine will rather than accident. The priests say that the lord of the island pronounced its end, that the falcon turned his face away, that the words that had established it were spoken again to dissolve it. The same speech that once brought the island into ordered existence is now said to unmake it. There is a symmetry here that matches the earlier emphasis on completeness. The island's end is as total in their description as its beginning. At the same time, there are hints of conflict within the divine company. Some passages speak of rebellion arising in their midst, of one who set himself against the decree, of blows struck upon the island. Other passages are more restrained and simply say that discord came into being there for the first time, The priests do not give these discordant forces names in the Edfu texts themselves, at least not in a way that would allow us to reconstruct a clear list of antagonists. They simply set up a contrast, where their speech was one, now their tongues were divided, where no one opposed the decree of the Falcon, now his command was resisted. Modern readers often look for naturalistic explanations behind such language, and some have wondered whether the priests might be preserving an echo of a flood, an earthquake, or some other remembered disaster. In this script, though, we are staying with what the building texts actually say. They are not a weather report. They are a temple theology. Within that theology, catastrophe functions as a way of marking the end of the First Age. The priests use the destruction of the island to draw a clean line between Shebtiw and every later time. Before there was a pattern in its fullness. After, there is a world in which that fullness can only be glimpsed in fragments. Egyptian tradition, more broadly, often speaks of cycles of creation, disruption and renewal, of times when Marat is fully present and times when it must be restored. The Edfu narrative fits quietly into that habit of thought without needing to reference other texts directly. The priests present the island as a completed form of order, then present its loss as something that opens the way for repetition elsewhere. They say that its image remained in the writings, that its plan was kept in the heart of the gods, that it would be raised again in other places. Destruction in their language does not erase the pattern, it relocates it. This is where the story of the island's end begins to touch the later history of temples like Edfu itself. But the building texts are careful not to let the island's destruction become a simple prelude to the next sanctuary. They keep the tone solemn and final. They say that the island sank beneath the waters, that its summit was no longer seen, that its name was hidden in the darkness. Whatever is carried forward is carried in memory and in text, not in a continuous physical landscape. For scholars such as Eve Reymond, this solemnity has suggested the possibility that the priests might be transposing the end of some earlier sacred landscape into mythic time, using the image of a drowned, burned or shaken island to account for why an older cult centre was no longer visible. In that view, the destruction motif could be a way of dignifying loss, of surrounding it with cosmic language. Finnestad and Kurth, by contrast, are more inclined to see the same material as a crafted theological device, an abstract end of the first time inserted into the narrative so that the Ptolemaic temple can present itself as part of a new divinely sanctioned cycle. The Edfu texts themselves do not tell us which of these readings is closer to what the priests had in mind. They only preserve the story in their own terms. An island that had been the place of completed order is said to have been overwhelmed by flood and fire, unmade by divine decree, and withdrawn from sight. Its pattern, the priests insist, did not vanish. It continued to exist as writing, as plan, as something held in the gods' memory. But the island itself, in their own careful words, was no more upon the surface of the water. They present this as a sacred narrative about beginnings and endings, not as a historical report, and it is in that quiet, ritual register that the destruction of the island belongs. Once the island itself has been pronounced finished, the building texts turn, almost reluctantly, to those who had lived upon it. The priests do not give us a long list of individual fates. Instead, they speak in broad phrases, as if even describing the end of these beings required a certain reserve. They say that their time came to its limit, that their offerings ceased upon the altars, that their names were stilled in the mouth of Re. The suggestion is not of bodies scattered in detail, but of a whole mode of existence being brought to a close. The Shebtiw, who had earlier been presented as the noble companions and protectors of the primeval god, are now spoken of in the past tense. The texts say that their company was diminished, that their circle was broken, that they did not stand in their places, In one passage, the priests write that the Shebtiw were cut off from their thrones, a phrase that blends the political and the ontological. To be cut off from one's throne in Egyptian ritual language is to lose function, not only rank. In another place, they say simply that they perished on that day, leaving the manner of their perishing undescribed. The Djaisu, the architect gods whose measuring had defined the island's form, are treated slightly differently. The texts do not always say that they themselves die. Rather, they say that their work was undone, that the places they had marked out were erased, that their cords and stakes were swallowed by the waves. Yet there are also lines in which the priests speak of their passing. One formula says that the Djaisu were laid low with their plan, another that they sank with the island that they had raised. Here, the perishing of the builders is bound to the perishing of what they built, as if creator and created had become inseparable in their end. Other beings who had inhabited the island are gathered under more general expressions. The texts speak of the eldest ones of the first time, of those who had come forth at the beginning, and then add that they were overcome by the flame and the flood. At one point, they say that no face remained above the waters, a line that later commentators have taken as the closest thing to an absolute statement of total loss. The priests themselves temper this by adding that their cas went to the sky, implying continuity on a different plane, but in terms of the earthly island, the language is stark. This language of ending is consistent with the way the Edfu inscriptions handle closure elsewhere. The priests favour expressions such as their years were completed, their service was concluded, their names were given back to the god. These phrases occur in funerary contexts and in royal annals, and at Edfu they are carefully repurposed for the Shebtiw and Djaisu. The perishing of the island's inhabitants is therefore not presented as a meaningless disaster. It is framed in the same ritual vocabulary that surrounds the death of kings and the nightly death of the sun, a passage marked, a cycle turning, a role fulfilled and then set down. Within the internal logic of the temple's narrative, this matters. The building texts have already suggested that the island's pattern survives as writing and as plan, hidden in the divine heart. If the Shebtiw and the Djaisu had simply gone on unchanged, the transition from Zp to later ages would be less sharp. By insisting that their time was finished with the island, the priests underline the uniqueness of that first constellation of beings. The world that follows cannot just be a continuation. It must be a re-articulation of order by other hands and other companies. At the same time, the inscriptions are not entirely consistent in their finality. Alongside the statements that they perished and their seats were emptied, there are quieter lines in which some trace of continuity remains. The texts say that their bass remained with the Falcon, that their protection was placed in his wings, that their counsel abode in his heart. In these moments, the Shebtiw and Djaisu are no longer visible actors on a cosmic island, but their qualities are said to persist, absorbed into the person of Horus, and carried forward in his later manifestations. Perishing in this theological frame can mean the end of a particular configuration without the loss of everything associated with it. This is also where the narrative begins to prepare the way for survivors, even before it names them explicitly. The priests write that those who were able to depart did so before the decree was fulfilled, that some few were led out by the god who foresaw the end, and that they went forth bearing the memory of the island upon their heads. These lines sit next to the more absolute statements about no face remaining above the waters, producing a deliberate tension. On the one hand, the island's community as a whole is said to have perished. On the other, a small, undefined remainder is said to have escaped, not as an intact society, but as bearers of remembrance. From a literary standpoint, this functions as a hinge. The perishing of the island's inhabitants closes the chapter of Zpt, while the hints of those who went forth open the next. For scholars like Eve Reymond, This transition has encouraged the thought that the Edfu priests might be compressing the disappearance of an earlier cult group, or priestly line into a single mythic event, dignifying their loss by placing it at the end of the first time. For Finnestad and Kurth, the same passage is read more as a crafted mythological device. The old company must be removed so that new sanctuaries and new divine communities can be introduced as part of an ordered succession. The texts themselves do not settle that question. They simply hold together two strands, a solemn affirmation that the Shebtiw, the Djaisu, and the unnamed eldest ones saw their earthly era come to an end with the island, and a quieter assurance that something of them remains, lodged in divine memory and in the few who leave before the final submergence. In the Edfu narrative, the perishing of the island's inhabitants is therefore not only an elegy, it is also the necessary precondition for the wandering figures who will appear next, carrying the island's pattern into a scattered world. In the next movement of the inscription, those few who were able to depart step out of the background and become the quiet centre of the story. The priests do not name them as a tribe or a house or a people. They call them simply those who had gone forth from the island, those who had seen the perishing, those who bore its remembrance upon their heads. The texts say that they found no resting place at first, that they went about upon the shores being afraid of the waters, that their hearts were heavy with what they had witnessed. It is a slow, restless picture, not of a heroic migration, but of a small band who have outlived their own world and do not yet belong to another. From this point, the building texts begin to stitch these wanderers into the sacred geography of Egypt, as the Edfu priests knew it. They write that they came to the places where the flood had not reached, that they beheld the hills that had stood firm, and that wherever they found a rock that had endured, they set down the pattern that was in their hearts. The suggestion is that the survivors do not found cities or kingdoms in the later political sense, but leave behind traces of the island's arrangement in particular spots, an elevation, a promontory, a mound above the waters. The texts say that they measured out small likenesses of that which had been destroyed, that they established cult places as copies of the first residents, and that they entrusted their knowledge to the gods who would dwell there. In several passages, the priests link specific Egyptian sanctuaries to these wanderings, though always in liturgical language rather than narrative detail. They say that they came to the mountain of Jebba, an ancient name used at Edfu for their own sacred hill, but they also speak of the mound of Jebu, which commentators connect with Elephantine, and of the first ground of Jezeret, which has been associated with more than one Upper Egyptian site. In each case, the formula runs along similar lines. It was there that they rested for a time. It was there that they traced a plan. It was there that they caused a divine falcon to alight. Through such phrases, the wanderers become the mythic bearers of temple beginnings. The priests are not giving a travel itinerary. They are weaving scattered shrines into a single remembered journey. Edfu's own place in this network is marked carefully. The building texts say that their steps were guided to this mound, that they recognized in it the image of the primordially risen land, and that they proclaimed it a likeness of the island of the egg. The survivors are said to set up the first stake here, to recall the chords of the Djaisu, to speak again the names which had perished with the waters. In this way, the wandering company serves as a hinge between the lost island and the visible stone walls of the Ptolemaic temple. The priests are tracing a line of descent, not of blood, but of pattern and remembrance, passing from the perished community of Zp into the sanctuaries of the Nile Valley. This motif of wandering has a particular symbolic function within the Edfu theology. In other Egyptian texts, the period after a great disruption is sometimes imagined as a time of roaming and uncertainty. The sun god's enemies fleeing, the Ennead moving from place to place, royal ancestors seeking a seat after a usurpation. The Edfu inscriptions adapt this broader theme, and give it a specific focus. They say that those who went forth were not yet established, that they were between the first time and the established time, and that they walked in the interval. In other words, their wandering is the interval itself, the stretch of mythic time that allows a drowned, unreachable island to be linked, step by step, to a later solid temple landscape. For Eve Reymond, this aspect of the text has been especially suggestive. She reads the references to the survivors founding cult places and tracing plans as echoes of real processes by which early sacred sites in Upper Egypt might have been related, perhaps by a loose network of priests or craftsmen carrying shared ritual and architectural traditions from one locale to another. In that view, the wandering figures would preserve a memory, however transformed, of an earlier sacred landscape now wrapped in the language of ZPT or Bwai. Finnestad and Kurth, working from the same lines, understand the motif rather as an elegant literary device, by which the Ptolemaic theologians at Edfu could retrospectively knit many temples into a single orderly scheme, projecting chosen sanctuaries back into a mythical migration so as to give them a common, dignified origin without implying any concrete historical journey. The building texts themselves remain firmly within their own theological frame. They do not step outside to comment on whether these wanderings took place in a way a modern historian would recognize. They simply affirm that the sacred domains were caused to arise by those who had remembered that they brought the pattern of the first time into the later time, and that they linked the mansions of the gods together as one lineage. When they speak of Edfu, they say that its plan was drawn from that which they carried, and that its foundations rested upon the words that had escaped the flood. This is the temple's claim about itself and its peers, that their sanctuaries stand in continuity with a vanished model, mediated by a small, unnumbered company of survivors. In this sense, the wandering survivors are less a people than a function. They are the narrative instrument by which the priests let the island's perfection survive its own destruction. Not intact, but refracted into multiple sacred domains along the Nile. Through them, the gulf between a mythic first occasion and the actual inscribed stone of Edfu is bridged, not by argument, but by a slow, reverent story of walking, remembering, and founding, retold in litany on the temple walls. In the next turn of the inscription, the wanderers begin to fade again into the background, and the temple of Edfu itself comes gently into focus. The priests speak less about feet on the road and more about stones in their places. They say that this house stood in the thought of the first time, that its ground plan was already in the island, and that its walls are a remembrance of what was before the flood. In these lines, the temple is not just one sanctuary among many. It is presented as an heir, a recipient of something older, a place where the pattern of ZPP is said to have settled and taken a new form. The building texts describe this in slow, repetitive phrases. They say that the divine Falcon chose this mound as his resting place after the storm, that he caused his first circuit to be traced here again, and that the house of Horus at Edfu became the copy of his first residence. The priests do not claim that the island itself re-emerged from the waters. Instead, they speak about likeness, shadow, and echo. Edfu is called the image of the island, its body renewed, its memory made firm in stone. In that way the island does not return as land, but as architecture and rite. The texts linger over the act of building as a ritual repetition of the first occasion. They say that the mound was encircled with the cord, that the corners were fixed in accordance with the words of the Djaisu, and that the chambers were arranged according to the decree that was spoken before the flood. For the priests, the work of laying out walls, measuring courts, and marking axes is not a purely practical craft. It is framed as a conscious reenactment of divine work carried out on the island of the egg. To set a boundary wall is to repeat a primeval separation of waters and land. To raise a sanctuary is to recall the first house that sheltered the Falcon, as the texts put it. This way of speaking belongs to a broader Egyptian habit that modern scholars often call sacred geography. A patch of ground is not only a place in physical space, it is also described as a where in mythic time. The Edfu inscriptions make that move very clearly. They say that this ground is the first ground, though it has risen in the later time, and that whoever enters this house enters into the memory of the first occasion. In other words, the temple is presented as a remanifestation of the mythic original, a localized reappearance of a pattern that once belonged to a lost island. The priests do not suggest that one could sail from the Nile to Zbty. They suggest instead that, by passing through certain doorways and participating in certain rites, one moves symbolically from the present back into that archetypal dawn. Within this frame, even the daily rituals are pulled into the orbit of the first time. The building texts say that when the bread is offered here, it is the bread of the first feast, that when the incense rises, it is the smoke of the altar that stood upon the island, and that when the hymns are recited, they repeat the words that were first spoken to calm the waters. Service in the sanctuary is not just maintenance of a local cult. It is described as a continual renewal of the conditions that, in the priest's theology, once established order after destruction. The island's drama is folded into the timetable of offerings, processions, and festival circuits. This has a clear institutional function as well. By composing their temple in this way, the priesthood of Edfu are not only telling a story about gods and mythical lands, they are also quietly telling a story about themselves. If the house they serve is the successor of the island, if its foundations are said to rest on the words that escaped the flood, then their own rights and offices become guardianship of something immeasurably ancient. The texts say that the learned ones of the house preserve the writing of the first time, that they are those who know the plan that was carried by the survivors, and that they renew the island by their service. In attributing such continuity to their temple, they also legitimize their own role as necessary intermediaries between a drowned beginning and the ongoing present. Here the enclosure wall on which these claims are carved becomes quietly important. It is not a neutral surface. It is itself part of the architecture that is being interpreted as heir to the island. The priests inscribe on the very boundary that defines the sacred precinct a narrative about the first boundary that rose from the waters. They say that this great wall is like the encircling wall of the island, that its circuit is as the circuit made for the first Falcon, and that its gate is as the gate by which the survivors came forth. In reading the text, one is walking alongside a stone structure that the inscription itself insists is a material echo of primeval containment and protection. Eve Reymond has emphasized this intertwining of text, wall, and site. She has suggested that such detailed references to measurement, foundation, and enclosure might preserve distant memories of early sacred constructions in the region, now wrapped in theological language. From that angle, Edfu's claim to be a successor site would be more than a literary pose. It would be a stylized recollection of real architectural continuities, refrained through the myth of Zptpi. Finnestad and Kurth, reading the same carved lines, see instead a careful Ptolemaic systematization in which an existing temple is retrospectively clothed in the dignity of primeval descent, its walls made to speak as if they had always been heirs to a mythic island, even though the story itself was being shaped in their shadow. The building texts do not resolve this difference in perspective. They do not step aside to say whether they are preserving an old memory or inventing a new link. They simply maintain in their own restrained way that Edfu stands in the place of that which has perished, that it bears the name of the island upon its precinct, and that it receives the gods as that first ground once did. In this way, the temple is written into the same long lineage that began with a sacred rise of land and passed through wandering survivors and scattered cult places into the ordered stone of a Ptolemaic sanctuary whose very outer wall proclaims itself the latest contour of a story that started, in the priest's words, before there was yet a king upon earth. We need to pause here and return quietly to the word that first drew us into this story. The title of this episode speaks of an island kingdom, and yet, by now, it may be clear that what the priests of Edfu describe is not a kingdom in any political sense that we would recognize. The building texts do not speak of dynasties, of human courts, or of named mortal rulers seated on thrones. They speak instead of a sacred domain, a circumscribed piece of primeval land, inhabited by gods and by figures who are only ever presented as divine, semi-divine, or mythically exemplary. When the inscriptions call this place the domain of the Falcon, or speak of it as ruled, ordered, or governed, they are not outlining a constitution. The language of lordship belongs to theology, not to statecraft. The texts say that the Falcon is lord of this island, that all the gods are under his protection there, and that he orders the ground and sets every being in its place. This is the governance of a cult image, a cosmic patron, a deity who embodies right ordering. It is not the rule of a human king with armies, taxes, and administration. In Egyptian, the same clusters of words can describe the authority of a god over a shrine, and the authority of a king over a province, and this is part of the difficulty. The priests write that this island is his kingdom, that its circuit is his estate, and that its inhabitants are his servants. For a modern reader, that can sound immediately like a lost nation, a forgotten people with a falcon banner planted in their soil. But within the internal logic of the building texts, those servants are gods, spirits, and mythic assistants, such as the Shebtiw and the Djaisu. The estate is a ritually bounded precinct in the first occasion, not a geopolitical unit on a map. The Falcon himself is not a founder of dynasties in the way later pharaohs would claim descent from Horus. He is already divine. The texts say that he came forth as Lord of the Sky, that he took possession of the mound as his first perch, and that he caused the gods to dwell in their houses. His lordship is described as the stabilizing of elements, the assigning of shrines, the calming of waters. To call him king in this context, as some translations do, is to lean on a convenient English word, but it risks smuggling in our own political imagination where the priests are speaking instead about cosmic hierarchy and cultic centrality. This distinction matters because it shapes how we understand every other detail that has been traced across the temple walls. If we approach the Island of the Egg as a literal proto-nation, then the destruction described by the priests can easily be misheard as the fall of a historical civilization, and the wandering survivors can slip, almost unnoticed, into the role of refugees from a drowned country. The building texts themselves do not quite say that. They present a sacred geography in which gods flee, divine craftsmen travel, and mythic sages carry plans from one holy mound to another. The wandering is ritual memory and theological linking, not a chronicle of human migration. Eve Reymond's reading does not change that basic frame. Even when she suggests that the Edfu material could be preserving distant recollections of earlier sacred landscapes or early cult centres in Upper Egypt, she still treats the island narrative as a theological construction, layered and worked over by priests. Her proposal concerns what might lie behind the imagery, not the claim that the island was once a sovereign human polity. Finnestad and Kurth just as firmly underline the Ptolemaic systematization, in which mythic domains are carefully mapped onto existing temples, but they too read the island as a sacred archetype, not as a national capital that has slipped from the pages of history. Keeping the word kingdom in its liturgical register also helps with the role that Edfu itself is given. When the priests say that this house is the kingdom renewed, or that the kingdom of the Falcon is founded again on this mound, they are not announcing the rebirth of a state. They are affirming that the same divine order, the same pattern of gods, shrines and protective walls has, in their view, risen again in stone along the Nile. The kingdom that is repeated is a structure of relationships between deities, a layout of sacred space, a way of telling how order emerges from threat. For that reason, it is helpful to be cautious with modern comparisons. It can be tempting to hear in this drowned island the echo of Atlantis, or to align the Edfu narrative with other stories of destroyed worlds and scattered peoples. The building texts themselves remain more restrained. They do not describe ships sailing between continents, human cities vanishing beneath the sea, or technological wonders lost to time. They speak of an island in the first occasion, populated by gods and their attendants, shattered in a divine conflict or flood, and then re-remembered in the layout of later sanctuaries. To take them seriously on their own terms is to let that sacred kingdom remain what the priests say it is, a mythic domain in which cosmic order is first established, disturbed, and re-established, rather than an entry in an unwritten political history. From that quiet vantage point, the island becomes less a missing chapter in human chronology, and more a theological tool, a way for the Edfu priesthood to anchor their temple in a story of beginnings, destructions and renewals that belongs, in their own words, to the time before there was yet a king upon earth. Before we turn to the two different ways scholars have tried to read the island of the egg back through time, we need to do something very simple and very stubborn. We need to look at when these words were actually carved. The building texts at Edfu are not Old Kingdom inscriptions. They are not Middle Kingdom hymns. They belong to the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers sat on the throne of Egypt, but the temples along the Nile were still staffed and written by Egyptian priests. The bulk of the Edfu inscriptions were composed and inscribed between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, more than 2,000 years after the age of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, and well over a millennium after the last pyramid fields had fallen silent. This is the dating problem. The priests of Edfu say they are recording very ancient things. They speak of primeval writings of the first time when the words of the gods were written down. They say that these plans were found in ancient books in the Temple of the Goddess, and that the layout of Edfu is copied from those earlier models. But as physical objects, the walls we are reading belong to a world where Alexandria already existed, where Aristotle was a recent memory, and where the Rosetta Stone would soon be carved in 3 scripts. Between the time when the Great Pyramid was built, around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, and the time when the Edfu priests cut their building inscriptions, lies roughly 1,500 years of unbroken Egyptian history. Dynasties rise and fall, religious emphases shift. Gods are merged, separated, reinterpreted. The language itself changes from Old Egyptian to Middle Egyptian to Late Egyptian and beyond. The script evolves from monumental hieroglyphs to cursive hieratic and demotic. By the Ptolemaic period, the hieroglyphs on temple walls have become both conservative and elaborate, an art of archaism where older forms are cherished and deliberately revived. What this means is that whenever we read the island narrative and think about memory, we are working across a very great distance. The priests of Edfu say they are preserving materials from much earlier temple archives. They say the plans of the island and of its shrines were copied according to the writing found in ancient rolls. It is entirely possible that some Ptolemaic descriptions are genuinely drawing on New Kingdom or late-period temple documents, and those earlier texts may in turn reflect still older traditions. But the stone we have is late, and the wording we can see has passed through many editorial hands. In that sense, the 1,500-year gap between the Old Kingdom monuments and the Ptolemaic temple has 2 sides. On one side, it makes the idea of a direct, unbroken, historically precise memory of a specific physical landscape much more fragile. On the other side, it gives the island narrative a much longer time to be worked on, polished, layered, and systematized within the Egyptian religious imagination. If a modern reader is hoping that the building texts will offer a kind of eyewitness report of a real drowned district, preserved perfectly from the time of the first pyramids, the dating argues against that. The Edfu inscriptions are not field notes from ancient surveyors. They are the end result of a long tradition of temple theology, arranged, systematized, and inscribed at a moment when Egyptian priests were very conscious of their own antiquity and very skilled at weaving older motifs into new compositions. For scholars, this produces a wide range of caution. Some take the dating as almost decisive, since the text is Ptolemaic, they argue. We should treat its narrative as a late theological construction that tells us mainly about how priests in the Hellenistic period organized their myths and sacred geographies. In this view, any hints of a real prehistoric landscape are too remote and too reworked to be recoverable. The Island of the Egg, its destruction and its wandering divine survivors belong to liturgy, not to recollection. Other scholars are more open to the possibility that, even in such a late form, the Edfu material could preserve echoes of early cult landscapes, now deeply mythologized. They would underline that Egyptian temple traditions were often conservative in content, even when creative in form. Old names of shrines, old patterns of processions, and old relationships between local gods could be carried forward for centuries. In this perspective, the fact that the story is told in the 2nd century BCE does not erase the possibility that something much older lies behind it, but it does make any reconstruction delicate and speculative. Everyone, however, has to reckon with the same basic constraint. We do not have Old Kingdom versions of the island story. We do not have Middle Kingdom papyri that clearly describe the first occasion in the same terms used at Edfu. What we have are Ptolemaic inscriptions that claim to be based on earlier writings. Whether those earlier writings were themselves mythic syntheses, or whether they contain more local, more concrete references that later priests generalized and reinterpreted, is an open question, and it is here that interpretations begin to diverge. The dating also affects how we think about the reliability of any geographical hints in the text. When the priests of Edfu speak about the island's channels, its encircling waters, its surrounding districts, and the later sites where wandering divine craftsmen settle, we have to decide how literally we can take that language. Are we hearing a distant memory of real stretches of Upper Egyptian landscape? Or are we hearing a theological map that overlays existing temples with mythic origins? The fact that these decisions are being made in the Ptolemaic period, long after the first major sacred centers were established, adds another layer of complexity. Out of this dating problem arise the two main scholarly responses that have shaped modern discussion. Eve Reymond approaches the Ptolemaic text with the possibility that it is, in some measure, a late crystallization of much earlier sacred topography, in which real, now altered temple landscapes have been folded into a myth of a primeval island. Finnestad, Kurth, and others, working with the same chronological facts, place more weight on Ptolemaic systematization, seeing the island narrative as part of a deliberate theological program that organizes older myths into a new, orderly framework centered on the Temple of Horus. Both readings accept the late date, both recognize the gap. Where they diverge is in what they think that gap still allows us to say. In the next section, we will follow Reymond's more permissive line of thought, in which the building texts may be preserving transformed memories of an earlier sacred landscape. After that, we will turn to the more cautious counter-reading, in which the same inscriptions are treated primarily as a Ptolemaic intellectual project. Between them, the dating problem remains, a quiet reminder of how far the stone walls of Edfu stand from the worlds they claim to recall. Eve Reymond was one of the first modern scholars to sit with the Edfu inscriptions in a very literal way, to read line after line of the dense hieroglyphs, and simply ask, as patiently as possible, what kind of reality these priests thought they were describing. In 1969, she published a long, careful study called The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple, And in that book she made a claim that has quietly shaped almost every later discussion of the Island of the Egg, whether people agree with her or not. The priests of Edfu, she argued, were not just spinning a timeless myth, they were preserving, in transformed and exalted form, memories of an earlier sacred landscape, a network of real cult sites and building programs that once existed somewhere in Egypt's past. Reymond did not say that the Island of the Egg was a prehistoric continent or a sunken world. She stayed within the frame that the priests themselves give. The texts say there was an island at the first occasion, surrounded by waters, planted with shrines, inhabited by divine craftsmen and their followers, destroyed in a catastrophe, and then somehow continued through the wandering of its survivors and the founding of new sacred domains. For Reymond, this pattern sounded familiar, not because of any connection to later legends, but because it echoed how Egyptian temples often talked about themselves in relation to older holy places. In temple after temple from earlier periods, she saw a habit of tracing a present sanctuary back to some earlier model, some prior shrine, sometimes in the same location, sometimes somewhere else along the Nile. So when she read the Edfu narratives, she chose to take the priest's language about plans, copies, and ancient roles seriously. The walls say that the ground plan of Edfu was drawn according to what was found in the ancient writings, that the dimensions of halls and courts were measured according to what had been prescribed at the first time, and that the shrines on the island had corresponding shrines in every domain of the god. For a purely allegorical reading, this could all be metaphor, a way of saying that the cosmic order expressed in the temple is eternal. Reymond agreed that this cosmic dimension is there, but she also pointed to the stubbornly concrete flavour of much of the text. The priests do not only speak of abstract heavens. They list precincts and workshops. They name individual chapels with particular functions. They describe storehouses, magazines, kitchens, and specific districts surrounding the island, some of which have names that are otherwise known from the cult topography of Upper Egypt. The texts say that divine builders travel out from the shattered island and settle in named regions, founding new domains of Horus and mansions of the gods. To Reymond, this did not read like a free-floating myth detached from any map. It sounded like a mythologized recollection of the way sacred space in Egypt had once been organized, with certain early centers providing the prototype for later cults. Her reasoning often turns on details that are easy to glide past. The way the inscriptions sometimes shift without comment between the island, as a singular site, and the islands or domains that radiate from it. The way particular craft gods are linked to specific types of building activity, and then associated with historical temple towns. The way the narrative of destruction and wandering results, not in an abstract salvation story, but in a distribution of cults along the Nile. For Reymond, these are the marks of a theological memory working on top of a now vanished arrangement of shrines and workshops, possibly very old, perhaps dating back to a formative phase of Egyptian religion before the classic temple system crystallized. She was also sensitive to the language that surrounds the so-called primeval writings. The priests say these were preserved in the house of the goddess, that they contained the designs of sanctuaries and the arrangement of cult images, that they were consulted when a new temple was to be erected. Egyptologists have long known that real temple archives, containing ritual books and architectural guidelines, existed in earlier periods. Reymond suggested that the Ptolemaic authors of the Edfu Texts genuinely believed they were drawing on such an archive, and that the myth of the island provided a way of folding that old technical material into a cosmic story. This does not mean, in her view, that we can peel the myth away and reconstruct a neat map of some prehistoric district. The process of mythologization is too deep, the theological reworking too thorough. But she thought that beneath the exalted language one can still discern an interest in actual layouts, actual sequences of building, actual hierarchies of cult centers. The island, in this reading, is at once the place of the first occasion and a memory of an earlier organizing center, perhaps a cluster of shrines and workshops that once formed a kind of archetypal temple city, later echoed and multiplied up and down the Nile. Within Egyptology, this was not put forward as a radical challenge to established history. Reymond worked with the same chronological framework as everyone else. She accepted that the inscriptions are Ptolemaic. She did not argue for civilizations erased from the archaeological record. Her proposal stayed inside a recognizably Egyptian horizon, that long before the Ptolemaic period there had been phases of cult development, shifts of religious capital, and that priests in later centuries remembered these shifts in the form of myth. Because of that restraint, her reading has been treated as a serious contribution, even by those who now emphasize other aspects of the text. You will still find her books cited in standard bibliographies, her translations and reconstructions used as starting points. Where other scholars might see the island narrative as primarily a late theological system, Reymond kept pointing the discussion back to the possibility of an earlier sacred geography, dimly visible through the Ptolemaic lens. For anyone asking how literally we might take the island story as a reflection of real tradition, her work marks one pole of the debate, a willingness to let the priests of Edfu be archivists as well as theologians, bearers of inherited patterns of holy ground, as well as authors of a sophisticated cosmic myth. In the next step of the argument, other Egyptologists will push against this, not by rejecting the texts, but by shifting the emphasis from recollection to construction, from surviving memories of ancient landscapes, to the deliberate, orderly systematization of myth in the Ptolemaic age. Other Egyptologists came to the same walls with a different set of questions. They did not doubt that the priests of Edfu were erudite, that they had access to older traditions, that they handled rolls and ritual books whose roots reached far back. But for scholars like Ragnhild Finnestad and Dieter Kurth, the most striking thing about the building texts is not what they might faintly remember. It is what they so carefully construct in their own time. When Finnestad reads the Edfu inscriptions, she pays close attention to how thoroughly they weave the temple into a complete vision of the universe. The texts do not only tell of an island at the first occasion. They align its chapels with the sky, its courts with the path of the sun, its workshops with the workings of the divine body. They map parts of the building onto parts of the cosmos in a dense web of correspondences. For Finnestad, this has the flavour of a system being worked out, not just a tale being retold. The Ptolemaic age, in this view, was a moment when Egyptian priests were engaged in grand theological synthesis, gathering strands from many older myths and cults and tying them together into orderly schemes that could be inscribed, codified and taught. Kurth, who has devoted decades to editing and translating the Edfu texts, approaches them with the same sense of the priests as active systematizers. In his commentaries, he often draws attention to the way formulae repeat, the way sequences of mythic episodes are arranged to match the architecture, the way titles and epithets are stacked to create layered meanings. The narrative of the island, for him, is one element in this larger project. The priests say that Horus is established on his primeval mound, that he defeats enemies, that his followers set up shrines, that a plan is inscribed and preserved. But the way these themes are handled, stitched into building rituals and daily offerings, suggests to Kurth a compositional process taking place in the very centuries when the temple was being decorated. From this angle, the references to ancient writings and to plans found in old rolls do not necessarily point back to a single remote prototype in the historical landscape. They can be understood as part of a time-honoured Egyptian strategy, legitimizing a present institution by grounding it in the timeless first time. The priests of Edfu say that their temple was built according to what was found, because that is how temples present themselves when they want to claim ultimate authority. They place their own work under the patronage of myth, not because they are copying a literal blueprint from an unknown early sanctuary, but because they are transforming many strands of tradition into one coherent theological edifice and then projecting that edifice back onto the first occasion. This fits with what is known more broadly about Ptolemaic temple culture. In this late period, priests at sites like Dendera, Esna, Philae and Edfu composed long, intricate inscriptions that reworked earlier religious material in new ways. Hymns were expanded, genealogies of gods were made more elaborate, festivals were tied together into orderly cycles. Older myths appeared in new combinations with fresh emphases to suit the local god and the political situation. The same basic story of divine birth, triumph and enthronement could be told slightly differently at each temple, highlighting that sanctuaries claim to be the place where the god's power is most perfectly manifested. Seen through this lens, the Edfu Island is not so much a window onto a lost sacred district as a crafted origin myth for this particular house of Horus. The priests recorded that there was once an island of the egg, that it bore shrines and workshops and was destroyed, that its survivors wandered and founded new domains, and that Edfu now gathers and completes that story. But for Finnestad and Kurth, the logic runs from the present temple outward. The building in stone becomes the fixed centre, and the island is shaped as its cosmic prototype. The intricate details about magazines, kitchens and craft quarters can then be read as theological elaborations of spaces the priests knew intimately, back-projected into mythic time, so that every room and every courtyard acquires primeval depth. In this mainstream reading, even the motif of dispersion and refounding has a functional role inside the Ptolemaic system. The texts say that the divine builders go out from the ruined island to establish domains of Horus in various regions. This can be understood as a way of acknowledging other cult centres while still giving Edfu precedence. All sanctuaries of Horus, the inscriptions imply, ultimately derive from this primordial source, which is now most fully embodied here. The myth becomes a map of religious hierarchy, ordering the relation between temples in the language of origins rather than the language of history. The choice, then, is not between myth and memory as simple opposites. The mainstream view does not deny that the building texts are full of traditional material, nor that some place names and cult titles may preserve very old patterns. It simply shifts the weight of interpretation toward the Ptolemaic act of composition itself. The priests of Edfu are seen as theologians first, archivists only second, using inherited fragments as raw material for a highly structured late theology in which the temple, its god and its rituals are all woven into a single comprehensive design. And yet even within this approach there is room for uncertainty. Finnestad and Kurth do not pretend to know exactly how much of the island's story goes back to earlier sanctuaries, or how far the primeval writings correspond to real archives now lost. They work with patterns of language and with parallels from other temples. Reymond works with the same evidence but lets other aspects come to the fore. Between these positions, the disagreement remains quiet but real. One side emphasizes recollection, the other emphasizes construction. The walls themselves continue to show both faces at once, a myth that arranges the universe around a Ptolemaic building, and a story that still speaks, however distantly, of other places and other times. In the next step, instead of trying to force a decision, we can return to the island narrative itself and follow the way it unfolds, watching how this tension between remembered landscape and constructed theology plays out in the final movement of the text. If we step back from the detail and simply listen to what the priests of Edfu chose to carve, the outline of their story is surprisingly clear and steady. The building texts say that in the first occasion there was an island, rising from the dark waters, bearing shrines and workshops and ordered spaces where gods and their assistants could dwell. They give that island names, They assign to it gates and courts and areas of activity, and they populate it with specific beings. The priests recorded that there were Shebtiw, that there were Djaisu, that there were groups of divine builders and sages who worked under the Falcon lord of the island, laying out plans, shaping tools, establishing a patterned life in the presence of Horus. The same walls say that this island order did not endure. At a certain point in their narrative, the priests tell of conflict and of catastrophe. The texts speak of enemies who are trampled, of hostile forces that attack the domain of Horus, of violence that culminates in the perishing of the island itself. They say that the buildings are destroyed, that the inhabitants are struck down, that what had been a coherent sacred settlement is scattered. Out of that scattering, the inscriptions continue, come small groups of survivors. The priests describe them as wandering, as carrying plans and memories, as founding new sacred domains in different regions. Eventually the texts say these lines of transmission converge, and the temple at Edfu is presented as heir to that broken island, as a place where its pattern is restored and completed. All of that, as we have seen throughout, is their voice, not ours. The island, its named inhabitants, its destruction, and its wandering survivors are the way the Edfu clergy in the Ptolemaic period chose to frame their temple and their god. In this video we have followed that framing, quoted what the walls say, and placed those claims alongside the views of modern scholars. We have not been saying that there really was a lost island kingdom before Egypt, or that we can reach behind the inscriptions to reconstruct a vanished civilization. We have only been tracing the contours of the story as the priests themselves preserved it, and watching how different readers have tried to understand what kind of story it is. For Eve Reymond, that narrative voice leans toward memory. When she hears the priests describe the island's layout, its quartered spaces and functionally distinct buildings, its destruction and the dispersion of its sacred personnel, she hears an echo of a real sacred landscape that once existed somewhere in the Nile Valley. In her reconstruction, the talk of primeval writings and of plans found in earlier rolls is not just a literary flourish, it is a sign that the clergy of Edfu were consciously preserving traces of an older cult complex, perhaps much older, and rehousing it in their own stone. For Finnestad and Kurth, that same voice leans toward construction. When they read the long lists of rooms, the detailed descriptions of magazines and kitchens, the way the mythic island is made to mirror the standing temple and the wider cosmos, they see theologians at work in the Ptolemaic age, arranging and systematizing received material. In their view, the ancient writings invoked by the inscriptions belong as much to a timeless mythic archive as to any specific historical site, and the island functions primarily as a carefully crafted origin myth for Edfu's own architecture and ritual life. We end, then, in the same quiet tension that has run underneath the whole exploration. The walls say that there was an island. They say it had named inhabitants and ordered quarters. They say it was destroyed. They say its survivors wandered and founded new domains, and they say that Edfu now gathers those scattered threads. Whether this should be heard as the distant recollection of a real early sanctuary, or as the late and intricate systematization of many myths into one comprehensive scheme, remains open. Reymond emphasizes recollection. Finnestad and Kurth emphasize composition. The building texts themselves continue to accommodate both readings without forcing us into one. Perhaps the most fitting way to leave them is to allow that uncertainty to stand. It is possible to let the priest's account wash over you without deciding whether every named island or workshop must correspond to a place on a map. It is possible to hold in mind, side by side, the idea of very old traditions dimly remembered, and the idea of skilled Ptolemaic theologians shaping those traditions into something new. The island can remain for us what it is on the walls, a place that belongs as much to sacred imagination as to any recoverable history. If you have drifted with this story all the way to the end, you can help it travel a little further. A gentle way to do that is to like this video, to subscribe to the channel so you can find your way back to the next long, quiet journey, and to leave a comment below. If you feel like sharing, let us know where you are listening from. Which part of the world has been the shore for this particular island of text and voice tonight? And if you would like to support this work in a deeper, steadier way, the best help you can give is simply to listen on Spotify. There is a link in the description. Playing the episodes there, letting them run in the background as you rest or fall asleep, does more than any algorithmic trick. It keeps the channel's own little temple of stories standing, so that we can keep returning, slowly and patiently, to walls like those at Edfu and the quiet, uncertain worlds they still contain.